Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the UNU-INWEH public event, the Science Talk. I am your host, Professor Grace Oluwasonya. Again, just a bit of housekeeping. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. At that point, there will be room for you to share your comments, Q&A, and any other contributions that you may have. Please type your questions or comments in the Q&A chat box, and we will pick them up from there afterwards. Thank you. The topic of today's talk is role of people's perception in flood management. So let's talk. Our presenter is none other than Professor Niru Agrawal. I hope I got that correctly. Professor Niru is an adjunct professor with us here at UNU-INWEH, professor in disaster and emergency management, and founding faculty member at the York University here in Canada. She's also a co-director, Canadian Defense and Security Network on natural hazards and domestic operations. She has over 35 years of experience in disaster risk management, emergency preparedness through community engagement, risk perception, threat assessment from potential natural, intentional, and technological hazards, public safety, disaster resilience in changing climate. She has a book on natural disasters and risk management in Canada, an introduction published by Springer. So I believe you agree with me that she is well placed to talk about flood management and how we could do better, especially in climate change era. So welcome with me, Professor Niru Agrawal. Professor Niru, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Grace. It's glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me to share some of the insights I have. So hello, everyone. Good morning. The topic of today's talk is role of people's perception in flood management. And I thought I'll start. I want to demonstrate basically that people's perception is a strong element in risk assessment, in everything we do in terms of estimating extreme weathers, the impacts of floods, and all of that related. So the work I am going to present today has been published in a Water Journal, and with a different title, obviously. And so people I worked with, my research assistant, Mark Elliott, and Professor Slobodan Simonovic. Also, the work I'm going to present today aligns with some of the sustainable development goals, in particular, sustainable cities and communities and partnerships to achieve the goal, those two. So the objective I am setting for this study is long-term flood resilience policies, and how all the different components have an important place when we strategize policies, and identify tangible difference in perceived risk and objective risk. And again, why that is important, that I want to demonstrate through this talk. So the background is Greater Toronto Area, which is about 6.5 million people right now, and projected to be 7.7 by 2030. Actually, that number is different depending on where you look at. And the study area in particular within the Greater Toronto Area is the city of Brampton. So I'm using the study area to demonstrate everything I just started the introduction with. The population of Brampton is 713 thousand as of 2020. It was founded in 1853. Visible minority, a high concentration of it, about 74%. So, and that's why that particular region, the area, becomes very important for this kind of study where people's perception really matters, has to be accounted for, assessed, and looked at in a tangible sense, not something which is a thought, an idea, but it actually really impacts. And Brampton has experienced multiple recent floods, notable past floods. One is 1954 Hurricane Hazel, which I think we still use that Hurricane Hazel flood as the design flood, 100-year design flood in the entire area. And before that was 1878 flood. And more recently, it's July of this year, we have had a flood in downtown Toronto, and I'll talk about that later in the presentation. So these works have inspired me to expand the application of the concept to the real world. So Vallée and Berkman proposed the method in 2006, and later on applied it to assess the world risk index. Actually, they applied it to 173 countries, and I've added people's perception dimension into the equation, what they have done. So I'm inspired by their work, but I've expanded it further. So the basic principle, a very, very simple concept, there's more complex things, but I'll just stay with the simplest one, which is the risk index is a function of exposure and susceptibility, coping capacity, and adaptive capacities. So the exposure in this model can be calculated. It's the likelihood of a hazard. It can be calculated as such. The risk index looks at two different broader categories of natural hazards: sudden onset, like floods and hurricanes, and slow onset as well, such as droughts and sea level rise. So I've divided the entire study is based on objective assessment of components and subjective assessment of components or parameters. So let me walk you through one by one each of those data sets and what they look like and how I have applied them to come up with the assessment of resilience. So I end up assessing resilience of the community. So let's look at objective data sets. So this is the Greater Toronto area, this entire region, and Brampton, this is my study area. And here you see dissemination areas, which is the smallest unit that you can find census data on. And Brampton sits here. Then I've used slopes determined from a digital terrain model, a watershed of the fourth order, and that's about 1,000 or so in Ontario. Then watercourses, and watersheds and slopes. So those are the GIS spatial data layers I've used. Then to measure exposure, I've taken a few things into account. So first here, what you see is GTA pipelines and transmission lines, because pipelines are accounted for potential risks from toxic leaks and explosions. Transmission hubs can cause major power outages, such as the 2003, if you remember, the blackout which paralyzed Ontario and parts of US. And most recently in July, like mentioned before, a transmission station got flooded in the downpour in July this year, causing widespread power outage in downtown Toronto. So that's why. So if you're close to those facilities, then so we are taking that as a proxy variable for exposure. Another proxy is highways, proximity to highways and rail lines, because this is 2013 Lac Mégantic. There was this highways and rail lines. They work both ways, actually. They pose a threat when accidents and explosions occur, and also present means for transportation and rescue efforts. So they go both ways. They can be taken into account in either side. Another rail accident example was Mississauga 1979, actually, and that was a pretty bad industrial accident like that. They can force thousands of people out of their homes, so they are exposed. Then industrial, toxic gas leaks, spills, tailings failures, and all that can pose. If you're close to those facilities, then they can pose, then you are exposed to hazards. Dump sites as well pose the same threat. Then how do you measure coping capacity? So measured coping capacity, just also very basic elements I've taken into account. The fire services, the fire stations, police stations, and hospitals. So if you're close to those, we assume that you have a certain level of coping capacity. You can also include community centers and shopping malls, usually good for evacuation. Then looking at objective susceptibility. So if you remember, I introduced the concept, the basic concept. So the susceptibility is one of the parameters there. So use census data to assess susceptibility. So looking at when the residence was constructed, is it owned or is it rented? And the people live there, can they speak the language, English or French, let's say, Canadian languages? Are they employed? Their age, any disabilities they might have, and what's the value of their properties? So using all those data sets or data points, have done objective susceptibility assessment. Then let's look at the perceived data sets. What I've done is chosen 4 locations in the city of Brampton. These stars you see, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the 4 locations, and conducted a survey. We designed a questionnaire, and we, my research team, my research assistants, graduate students, and myself, we all, and with this, at the time was the manager, emergency management of the city of Brampton. Actually, he facilitated so gave us locations, and then we will set up shop and then help people to fill out the survey questions. So we one-on-one basis, we talked to everyone, we made sure that they understood what was being asked, and so on. So let's say Thiessen polygon method was used for delineating the representative area of each survey location. So the 4 location, we assume that each location, depending on the Thiessen polygon method and the population and everything. So this is the area they will represent. And within those areas, these are the dissemination areas falling within those areas. Survey locations. Now, briefly looking at the steps to apply the concept to the study area. So objective data using census and GIS, subjective data collected using surveys, and the main parameters we have susceptibility, exposure, and lack of coping capacity, because everything is negative. So we could choose coping capacity, but I chose to do lack of coping capacity so that everything is, all the negatives are adding up together. So, and then developed a system, a formula, and applied it to determine objective and perceived resilience. So just to recap, exposure, walking you through each of the 3 parameters. So actual, derived from GIS data sets, proximity to highways, the actual data on the ground. So that's based on that. Perceived exposure derived from surveys if respondents live near a site that they considered. So that's where the difference you will see will arise, is what they consider dangerous and what we collect information from the ground as being dangerous location. Then susceptibility, the objective derived from census data, looking at the construction age of residents, home ownership, language, and so forth. And perceived derived from surveys, again, asking people about their home ownership, about their how many members is their home, is the household crowded, do they speak the language, are they connected to their society, and so forth. Then coping capacity, exactly the similar way. Objective of looking at income, education, proximity to emergency services objectively, and at the same things perceived one from surveys. And then I designed a system to allocate, to convert all of this information in binary format. So allocating 0 and 1, 0 and 1, depending on individual parameters, element, component, parameter here 3, exposure, susceptibility. You can also assign weights. I've randomly assigned 20% to exposure, 40% to susceptibility, 40% to coping capacity, lack of coping capacity. And then a little bit of potential hazard situations I have listed here. This is objective assessment. So objectively speaking, where the highways are located, railway tracks, etc., all the things, layers I just showed you. And then designed a system to allocate 0 and 1, depending on where they sit within this entire concept. Done the same thing for perceived assessment. So it's depending on, based on survey questions, exposure, susceptibility, lack of coping capacities, and the questions. According to question and its response, binary values were assigned so that all the variables and all the different components, and at each stage, they were all normalized in order to, because we are sometimes counting buildings, sometimes we're counting people, sometimes it's distance of the rail network, and sometimes it could be area. So at every stage, every variable has been normalized so they can work together. So showing you some of the steps of the calculation, here is exposure. So created a buffer, 1 kilometer buffer around the highways, around pipelines, around rivers, around dump sites. So just so that within that buffer, you will have a certain level of exposure, so higher than the areas outside. Then calculating coping capacity, again, creating a 1 kilometer buffer around all the facilities, all this infrastructure in place that we estimate or we consider that they will help in case of something hazardous situation arises. So those are the fire stations, police stations, hospitals, and ambulances. So those are the areas, some of the essential services located within a kilometer of the residences. So number crunching we're doing in GIS, and that's why the accuracy, we trust the accuracy. It's done on the smallest unit is a dissemination area. One dissemination area can actually have several households, but that's the smallest unit that's available to us. Then the equation I've used is to calculate lack of resilience. So here what you see is objective. Lack of resilience equals exposure plus susceptibility plus lack of coping capacity. And here you can allocate weights. So you can multiply by weights, and that weights depend on the exact area, the study area, the type of locality, the type of community. Some communities are affluent, some are not so. Some are very mixed culturally, some are not. So those things will depend. And then resilience, objective resilience is 1 minus lack of resilience. So that's just for convenience. And then combined resilience is resilience perceived plus resilience objective. So next, let me show you some of the results. So we have lots of maps coming out of this application of this entire method. So I'll just show you just a few, and then I'll show you the final result that we arrived at. So objective and perceived exposure measured in one survey location. So one survey location, if you look at this is objective and this is perceived. So there are subtle differences. I don't know if I mentioned, we have about 100 responses to the survey question. So we stayed with that 100. So the perceived, when you look at perceived, what you have is extrapolated from 100 responses. And that's why there are differences. There are differences in shades, but you don't see probably as clearly as if you were to do the study for the entire community, really, household level. Then another example I want to show you is objective and perceived susceptibility measured in another survey location. So the one before, this is a susceptibility. So one location, this is objective, and this is perceived. So this is the area to focus on. You see darker shades of orange, lighter shades of orange. This is objective susceptibility. And perceived susceptibility is more than the objective one. Now, this one is resilience, the total resilience calculated, objective versus perceived. So on this side, you see objective. I've circled an area where actually if you pay close attention, you might be able to see some difference in shades of green. And this is perceived. This is objective. That's resilience, combining all the parameters. Then combined outcome resilience, if you combine the objective and perceived for the study area, this is what you get. So this is, the method is to demonstrate that perception is important. It does show in calculations, and we have to, it's not prudent to ignore perception, and we base all our strategies only on objectives, assessment of risk, objective assessment of all the variables and components we risk is a function of. So that's important. They, like I said, every variable at every stage of calculation, we have normalized the series, all the variables. So it's what you see here is between 0 and 1, and 1 being positive. If someone is darker greens are resilient neighborhoods, and some areas here they have no data, or it's only agricultural fields, so no people not living there. So the takeaways: perceptions can be different from reality, therefore need to be taken into account when policies are designed and decisions are made. Perception can make the difference between people heeding the extreme weather or flood warning or ignoring it. And I'm doing another study actually looking at the extreme weather forecast. So sometimes, the weather forecast can be off. It's not accurate always. So sometimes that may be the case. But other times, people don't heed the warnings. When they don't heed the warning, and what is the reason? So risk communication strategies rooted in good understanding of community perceptions have a greater chance of being effective. So why people do not heed warnings, that needs to be understood. I think people's perception has to be taken into account in every aspect of a disaster risk management. Then lastly, what I've listed here is flood risk and damage reduction programs may require cooperation of communities And that could be creating sufficient room for the river to flow freely and to be able to flood occasionally, just like the Don. The Don River Valley, like it was straightened more than 100 years ago. Meanders were removed, and that created the entire the Don Valley Parkway Highway, north-south artery, and all of that is prone to flooding. So that prone to flooding, now we are trying to rectify that by naturalizing the mouth of the Don. And so maybe some things will improve in the downtown. The river is draining down to Lake Ontario. But that needs to be seen. I think the project is still ongoing. There's 2 more years to go for the project to be completed, and we'll see how that goes. But that is the thing about the people's cooperation and their acceptance and their convincing is extremely important, because when they support some program that experts feel is necessary, then it'll be successful. So home retrofitting and other measures, they will be successful. So I'll quote, there was another survey done. I'm sure many of the viewers, they already know about this. About 92% of the respondents in Ontario, actually, they didn't know they were living in the floodplain. So this is about over 2,000 surveys done, questionnaire surveys were done, and people were living in the floodplains, and they had no idea that they were. So why would, when the retrofitting or tax incentives or other measures for mitigation measures are proposed, and if there is uptake, will increase if people are convinced, if they perceive the methods or the measures to be exactly as important as the objective assessment of that is showing. So with that, just want to acknowledge the manager emergency management, Elaine. Elaine has retired now. My research graduate assistants and a little bit of funding from Answer Create at SAM. And with that, I'm well within the time limit. I hope there are questions so we can fill in the remaining half hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Niru. Just a minute. Bring on screen. Okay. Wow. I have a lot of questions actually, but first and foremost, thank you for your presentation and the very calm way in which you talk us through to have a clear understanding of why perception is always very important and critical, and I'll pick my first question from the overall goal that you presented at the beginning. It is to tie to long-term flood resilience policies. And very quickly, it flagged something in my head that, well, in this era of climate change, when everything is changing and quite rapidly, and frequently, how sustainable or feasible are long-term policies in this changing times?
That's a great question. How sustainable they will be, long-term policy. I think the long-term, medium-term, short-term we use the long-term policies will guide our thinking, our thoughts, and where we are going. And you might have to tweak, obviously, long-term, like you said, the climate is changing, everything else is changing, and the world is dynamic, the universe is dynamic. Things will definitely change. Today is not like yesterday, and tomorrow will not be the same as today. So long term, I think, is important to set and to have some sort of guidance in front of us so that we can look at the short term. So long term, projections, I'm not a huge fan of projections for the same reason, like you said, how sustainable that can be. So we can project something based on what we understand today and project the next 10 years, but the projections may not come true. But just to set some sort of guidance based on our understanding today, I think that's helpful.
Okay, I'm convinced. So I won't ask a follow-on question in that regard. But again, when you were talking us through the census data, I noticed you didn't really pay attention, correct me if I'm wrong, on differential data set, especially on the subjective aspect, So one, how can that be captured? Because I am very sure the perception of women will differ from how men perceive, disaster risk. Why do I know that? I know in terms of risk appetite. The other gender seems to have a high risk appetite than the female gender. Or again, correct me if I'm wrong. So now lumping the whole perception theory into the same box seems a bit what's the word I'm looking for now? Seems a bit too simple to put it, mildly.
So I got parts of what you said I missed, actually.
Oh.
Got lost in somewhere in the sound.
Oh.
Should I stop sharing, Grace?
No.
Okay.
You can keep sharing. I said when you were talking about the census data, I noticed that I wasn't sure, correct me if I'm wrong, that especially in terms of this perception, the subjective aspect, that there's no differential. You didn't mention anything about differentiating men perception from women perception, and I know that in terms of risk, when you're talking about risk appetites do differ by gender. I know men do have, literature convinced us of that men have, stronger or high risk appetite than women. So now that we are talking about perception, the role of perception in risk management as it relates to all these natural hazards. So how have you captured the differences in perception, in this regard? And if you have not, are you aware of that and you hope to do something about that or what?
Yes, absolutely. Another fine question. Absolutely. So I have not taken that into account, and it is absolutely an important aspect of perception. So there is another piece that I've done based on only surveying women about their risk perception, but that's a separate study. It's not been taken into account in this one because when we set up shop at 4 locations and talking to people about the questions we wanted to ask, whoever, woman, men, whoever stopped and showed interest, we just surveyed them and then we took their point of view, their views as the household point of view. So that for that, but then exactly what you're saying needs to be taken into account. It is extra, certain cultures like South Asian culture. I chose Brampton for another reason. I speak a couple of dialects, languages spoken in that region. So I could talk to people. They felt free and open to talk to me, and that was very important. But the men-women thing is also very cultural in those households. And I am absolutely sure that'll make a difference in the overall perceived risk assessment.
It's okay. In this survey, Niru, can you tell us what actually the main concern that people, show? What's the main perception? What's the main concern? Let's leave the numbers 0 and 1, the binary numbers. Let's leave them for from what you can pick, from those respondents. What's actually the main issue for them?
The main issue is it's not their priority. The households are the way we design a study and we want to roll it out. We want to gather information. That's not how people think. They don't wake up every morning thinking of, is there going to be a flood? Am I exposed to flood? Am I close to an industry? They only know that when they are faced with one. For example, 2008 propane gas explosion. That in that incident, actually the neighborhoods there when the explosion occurred and the glasses, the windows and doors of the apartment buildings got shattered, asbestos was in the air, and the health risk was told to them, was actually shared with the people. Then they knew, oh, we were living here and the highway was closed for 12 hours. So when something like that occurs, now they're thinking. Now I go to this community and I sit down and talk to them, and I'm talking about all these things. So this is not their focus. So they are kind of taken off guard. Now they're thinking with me, thinking through, oh, this, oh, that. But you know what, their everyday worry, what you're saying, what is their major concern? Is there if they have disabilities, if their income is not enough, if they don't speak the language, and there was something in the neighborhood, they will say, they shared with me, and the pamphlets were distributed for information, and the mother and the father, they live alone, they couldn't read, the son will come every Sunday, so they had to wait for the son to come, and so the communication they thought was not enough, and all the things that I'm talking about, they said, oh, we didn't know this, so I have no idea. So there's language barrier, there is income barrier, employment, unemployment is also pretty widespread. So those are the things they're thinking about. And when you talk about the exposure, the susceptibility, education level, education. So if you say, oh, if you're educated more, you will make more money, you will have better chances of getting an employment. They are thinking, but I need the money now, so I need to work. And more education sounds good. Yes, we will do it, but not right now. I need to work at McDonald's to make ends meet.
Prof Niru, you know, all these things are relatable. We're all humans at the end of the day, because I can just, put myself in their scenario. Maybe I earn just about 1,000 Canadian dollars. That more than 90% of it is going into letting. And I have 3 kids they need to feed. And all of a sudden somebody is asking me, hey, risk on flood, and I mean, it won't be my priority. So so that's expected. So we don't live in an abstract world. These are lived experiences of people. But going away from there, somebody is actually asking, this question, that in the census talk, some of the things you pick. Okay, let me read it as it was written. I would love you to expand on the perception. I would presume perception is more of individual thinking and views. But I did not get why you used variables such as education, income, and so on to measure perception.
A great question. Obviously, the income, if you do not, I used income, and what else you mentioned? So let's say
education, income, and the rest. Okay. So why have you chosen those?
Yeah, so lack of education makes you more susceptible to if you're exposed to any risk, lack of income, lack of education. Because again, like I mentioned before, lack of education means you're less interested in. So this is my assumption. Here is my assumption. So like perception, we are talking about people's perception, and I'm including my perception as well. So I am using certain proxy variables to assess certain things. Education, if you're less educated, you're more susceptible to, let's say, misinformation, disinformation, and all other kinds of dangerous things out there. It's that social media is rampant. If you have not enough income, then you lack coping capacity, so less income, and that's why that's related. So I need to measure people's perception about that, what kind of where they're at in their income level, education, and something else was mentioned in the question.
that why have we used that when it is the opinion of people we actually need?
Exactly. So we need people's opinion about that because we need to understand that what exactly what they are perceiving, income and education being associated with, does that align with our objective assessment? So I am assuming that lack of education, lack of income, lack of employment will lead to this, and this, all of these things. Does that actually match with what they are thinking?
Okay, thank you. Another question, quite a mouthful, but I'll go through it, as calmly as I can. Okay, I work in water programs in Africa. My interest in this area was piqued during conversations around early warning systems, which raised the importance of understanding community baselines and definitions for extremes rather than imposing the understanding or assessment of the project implementers. I'll be grateful if you could signpost me to any basic tips or resources you would regard as a useful starting point for better incorporating community perceptions in our risk assessments and communications of risk or warning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Is it here? Can I see it in writing?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, you are right.
You should be able to access the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Yeah, click on Q&A.
So is it this one, please? I would love you to expand on the perception.
No, it's on I work in water programs in Africa.
Right.
Thanks for a fantastic session. I work in water programs in Africa.
I don't have it. I have only 2 questions.
If you scroll up, it should be the last one, the earlier one.
No, so the question and answer is not showing me that. Maybe it's something you are looking at from your end.
Okay.
I'll try my best. So this is, can you just repeat some key points from that?
So his interest was piqued around early warning systems, which raised the importance of understanding community baselines and definitions for extremes, rather than imposing the understanding or assessment of the project implementers. So his question is, I will be grateful if you could signpost me to any basic tips or resources you would regard as a useful starting point for better incorporating community perceptions in our risk assessment and communication of risks or warning.
Got it. Yeah. So the early warning system raised importance of, I got the comment now. Yeah, it's an excellent point. It's an excellent point rather than imposing the understanding of the project implementers. Exactly. So that's exactly the point. I've also done a study with a student of mine from Nigeria, looking at the gas flares. So all the people living in those communities where this constant methane gas flares are occurring. And the community, people living next to those, they have either no option to move, they cannot move, they have to live there. So they have to ignore, or they're not aware of the dangers of the kind of exposure they suffer, other than when they get sick. Now they go to the doctor and then they say, what's happening? And then they figure out, where do you live? And they live very close to all these exposures. So the basic tips or resources useful starting point incorporating. So this is what we did also in that study in Nigeria, is went to the communities, actually worked with some students in the community college and college professors, and went around communities talking to people, so we have to understand their perception first. We have to understand and meet them where they are at. So if they are thinking all those things, first collect their insights and opinions and thoughts, and then then you work backwards. Then you try to see, okay, where this particular opinion or all those things, do they align with theoretical concepts that we understand as experts? And meet them there. So that's how you will do incorporate the perception. The risk assessment and communication of risk warning, exactly this is what I'm also doing with Environment Canada's project, is trying to understand where the gaps are, where the communication is falling short, in what kind of language and methods and media we should be telling people that, why the trust is not there. And the trust you can find, first of all, talking to people will tell you what is lacking, where are the gaps, what are the differences between our understanding and their understanding. And then you try to fill in those gaps and try to bridge those gaps.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. In terms of communication, I've done something on different contexts, but something similar in that regard. And the major finding was, if you really want to communicate to the grassroots, you go via the radio, because most of them are busy chasing their livelihood. They call it hustling. And so they do not have the luxury of sitting behind the TV. So if you put a major information on a television network, you have missed majority of the people that is intended for. So I appreciate that. But one of my colleagues has a question to ask. Matthew.
Yeah, thanks you, Grace. Hi, Niru. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is about the formulation of the risk. Like, for example, this is about flood risk, and last flood happened there in 1954. So, and in your exposure, I didn't see the hazard part, like where the flood prone area of this. And so then the people might think about whether what is the probability of this hazard to occur in the region. So that might be important to formulate the risk. So how did you incorporate that into this formulation of the risk part?
Oh, the probability. So probability you don't see here. So if I take you to the model, probability of risk you don't see here. Again, yeah, another excellent question. So exposure, we just calculated exposure based on all the elements that you saw, that I showed you, but the probability itself has not been calculated, has not been included in the calculation of risk.
My point was like the hazard part, because if we say it is exposure to flood, but there is no chance of flooding in the region. So then how we can say this is an exposure to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought of how can you say exposure to flood, but then Brampton is prone to flooding. This area where I have surveyed, so I don't have a slide with me, but in the past 2021, in the past 5 years, there have been two freshets, so ice jam flooding, and there is two rivers confluence there in that region. And the survey locations are not far from there. They are within 4 kilometers. So that region is prone to flooding.
Okay, Miriam.
Thank you so much. This is really fabulous. I appreciate the time to ask questions. I wanted to go back to the point that you made about meeting people where they're at. And I was interested in if you had any data on proportion of undocumented folks or people who might have, I guess, thinking about perceptions around resilience, if you did any looking into hesitation to contact police or first responders, and if that's something that you might in the future look into.
Excellent. Yeah, in the future, yes, I mean, that is a real issue. What you just mentioned is a real issue. With the community I went to, exactly, it wasn't an issue. So if there were people, of course, they will not come forward and talk to me because they want to run away from anything official, anything government. But this thing has to be looked into. I have read many studies. They are mostly for us in Canada. I think Quebec side, the border towns. I think you see those issues over there. And they will not come out, and they would rather, and then they might hurt themselves in a fire or ice storm or somewhere because they were hiding and they did not come out. So this has to be taken into account. And yes, in my future studies, I'm making a note to myself to look into that. But in California, actually, there have been many cases where in forest fire, people did not come out, and then undocumented folks, they died.
Well, on a global scale, Niru, I know those that carry out normally do this WRI, this World Risk Index. I've used their data set, a couple of times when I was assessing water security, for Africa, and we use part of it in the global water security assessment. So now on the global scale, I'm wondering, is there a possibility of collaboration in them actually expanding the WRI, to include this perception aspect?
A very good thought. Global scale, again, like you were saying, long term, is that sustainable, long-term strategies and policies. So the global is another global scale I am not sold completely on. I prefer local scale, but it's that perception is important. So what you just touched on a very important aspect, that perception is important. So that should be taken into account on the global scale as well. And it should be. Yes, I will be interested if there is any chance of getting involved in any of the launching a study, large scale study where you have partners from all the continents and all the countries and all regions, not all the countries, you cannot, but regions. Yeah, we should do that. We should definitely do that. But what happens in these large-scale global studies, including the global climate model, is that the variables end up being lumped. So you start with, you want to have 100 variables, but you start to lump them slowly because then you realize, oh, I can't, it's very hard to get information on this one. This data point is hard to get. So you lump 5 into 1 and it becomes 1. And you're losing the resolution of the model along the way. And at the end point, actually, I have noticed in many models that you end up having some sort of aggregate which can be misleading. I'm not saying it is, but which can be. So just a caveat there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right, actually. Any more questions from the room? Have it? Okay, yes, please. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you for nice presentation and nice organized this nice session. I thought this is in person. Not online. I didn't see the site. This event is online. Please, for next session, yeah. Send the link. Thank you again for the good presentation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation.
So you have fans in town who want to see you in person. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk and reminding us about an overlooked element. Still continues to be one of the major, I would say, overlooked elements of flood management. Understanding the communication of risk and how things work. And some of the how the different variables that would affect it, and so we are also having a project right now with the NOAA, it's on the other side of the border.
Yeah.
And, you know, so it's with similar things, we're working with essentially the program managers, those who do weather forecasts and those who do get involved in rescuing people. And one of the things is that, you know, though there are sometimes even no solution because there are people who live in basements and can't afford relocating, moving, some of these things. And I think often we forget these major issues, and the work of you and other people like you highlight those very important realities. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the comment.
Okay, on this note, we say once again, thank you, Professor Niru. Hopefully, I've invited you to an in-person meeting. I mean, lunch at UNU-INWEH, because you're just a neighbor, you know, very close to us. So please come around sometimes. Let's have a real in-person conversation, more so when we have a lot of fans here rooting for you. You know, so once again, thank you for your time. Thank you for the insights you've provided into your work. And hopefully soon, you know, you'll be presenting again.
Looking forward to it. Thank you. Thank you, Grace.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Note, we say thank you to everyone who had logged in to join us in this public event. See you again next week. Thank you all. Bye. Yes.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Well, a lot of thank you are coming to you. Well, from Lucia Sanchez saying thank you, Professor Niru, for the excellent presentation. If there are more questions, I'll collate them and get them to you. So thank you, everyone. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.